Yeah, good morning, everyone, and welcome to this webinar on the value of storytelling. So using stories to facilitate attachment and healing. Just to say, yes, I am one of the therapists here at Family Futures. I'm a certified play therapist, so that's sort of my background. Additionally, I am qualified as a group sound therapist. So that's using sounds, so like gongs, drums, things like that to facilitate sort of like health and well-being. And in my spare time, I like to paint, so I'm an artist. And I think most importantly for this morning, I'm a lover of stories. And hopefully as we go through, I think we'll be able to see that stories are sort of everywhere and something which play quite a significant role in all of our lives in various ways that they pop up. So yeah, hopefully as we sort of go through, we're able to see how that all sort of manifests itself. So yeah, stories are really incredible, I think, in that way. I think there were a number of themes coming up there around just emotions, like feeling emotional. And I think that's quite, in some ways, it's amazing that this collection of words and some of these visuals has this power to make us feel things or to help us to wonder and to go into our imaginations or to think about how we might be able to utilize this story in other settings. That it's, yeah, quite amazing in many ways that stories have that capacity. And stories really, I mean, they're sort of everywhere. There we go. So yeah, stories, they're sort of one of these things which are everywhere. So if we were to take a second again to use the chat box, and if it feels comfortable for people to share what their favorite, it could be your favorite book, your favorite film, favorite television program, your favorite song, to share what that is and to share what it is that you like about it. So just to, as I was saying before, like feel free to share what feels comfortable for you to share. Like it's completely up to you. And just to give you a bit of a sense of it, like if I was to share my favorite television program, probably The Simpsons, because it's obviously quite funny, so it makes me laugh. But also it reminds me of my childhood and hanging out with my siblings. We used to watch it a lot together. And I think the characters in it are quite complex and some of the jokes are quite complex as well and have kind of these hidden meanings, and I really like enjoy that. So yeah, you don't have to go into that sort of level of detail, but just to sort of give you an idea of what I'm sort of inviting you to do. So I'll give you a minute to have a think and to pop in favorite story from whether it's a book, a television program, and I'll share with you as we go through. So we've got Velveteen Rabbit, the child's book, Harry Potter, film Up, Connections and the Pain. It's something that happens and changes can also happen. The Charlotte's Web, for the connections as well. The Mockingbird, because of the themes that are in it, and every time I reread it as an adult, I take a new. Oh, sorry, this is going way too fast for me. Babe, Destiny was changed by one key caring person. Amazing. Yeah, The Cosby Show as a kid, because it looked like a big, warm, funny family. So there are a number of these themes coming up, it seems like, around like the connections that are in them, like the Marvel films, the variety of characters, different backgrounds, memories of childhood. Charlotte's Web again, so kindness and patience, weave the web of love. So it's incredible, I think, that these stories, which ultimately are made up by people, are able to have this impact on us, that we're able to build these connections around these things, which are, yes, essentially just like a collection of kind of a retelling of events. but they can speak to us on a much deeper level. Yeah, The Invisible String, big fan of that book as well. Yeah, so yeah, I think stories are quite incredible in that sense. So yeah, let's move on. So where do we hear stories? So there's some quite obvious places that we hear stories. So we talk about books, films, television programs, songs, in fine arts, comedies, plays, Disney films, etc. So those are some quite sort of obvious places, I guess, that we hear stories. There are also some less obvious places too in which stories come out. So things like through marketing and advertising and things like traditions. So every year, I think there's always a big anticipation about what the John Lewis Christmas advert is going to look like and what story are they going to tell or which issue are they going to be addressing in it. When someone's trying to sell you a car, often they're trying to sell you values also. They're trying to tell you a story about like what it means to own this car or whatever. In the same way, traditions, again, these are ultimately all invented, but at the same time, each of them have their own story behind them, and they are different across various cultures. So in a few days, we'll celebrate Valentine's Day, or some people will celebrate Valentine's Day, and that has its whole story behind it. A few weeks ago, it was Chinese New Year, and that has its whole story around it. A number of weeks ago in the United States, they celebrated Martin Luther King Jr. Day, and that has obviously its whole story behind it. So there are all of these sort of like these stories can like impact us, I guess, on a not just an intellectual level, but also on like a bodily level. That these ultimately tell us about who we are. These stories. It's really stories that we're learning that we can learn about values and traditions. And then as well as that, I guess there's also the everyday places that we hear stories. So how was your weekend? What did you do at school today? How was work? What did you do on your holiday? These are all opportunities, I think, where we're able to actually get into telling stories. And in that sense, I think with a lot of these earlier kind of themes, books, films, etc., there are people who get paid, obviously, to create and construct stories. But really, I think everyone, to some level, is a storyteller. And everyone is able to, find ways of communicating stories, even if it is just in how was your day. And in that sense, I think stories, that's all a story is. It's just an account of a series of related events or experiences. And in that sense, stories are everywhere, and everyone, I think, has the capacity to be a storyteller. And I think that's important to hold in mind as we sort of look at how this is going to relate to using stories as a therapeutic tool to support our children. So let's think a little bit more about stories here. So stories have the capacity to connect us, to help us to make sense of the world and communicate our values and beliefs. A good story makes us think and feel and speaks to us in in a way that numbers and data and even these amazing presentation slides can't speak to us in like on the way that stories can. There's some of the things that people were saying about the story, like their favorite book or film. Like these are really powerful things to say that like this made me think, like reminds me of my childhood, or reminds me of like the importance of love and all of these. Like these are quite amazing things that come out of stories, which sort of data can't sort of match. And stories create that magic and that sense of wonder of the world. Someone mentioned what it was like hearing the story of the boy who built the wall around himself, and how listening to the story allowed their imagination or the visuals to come out slightly differently. And that's one of the sort of the gifts of stories, is that it allows our imagination to take us, allows us to create that magic and that sense of wonder. But additionally, yeah, stories teach us about life, teach us about ourselves, about other people. It's a unique way that children can develop an understanding and a respect and appreciation for other cultures. So I mentioned like 3 things just there about Valentine's Day, Chinese New Year, Martin Luther King Jr. Day, the whole sort of plethora of different traditions, festivals, religions, etc., that we can sort of learn about through stories. So there's a lot to sort of be gained from them in that way. And as well as all of this, like they're quite an important bonding activity, the sort of the process of storytelling. By bonding, that's just like any activity which increases the physical proximity between people and facilitates that feeling of safety and security and of trust and affection. And additionally, you know, stories are timeless, they're universal, like every culture on this planet really. Throughout history, people have always told stories to each other. They are a way of conveying family history, of passing on traditions, passing on beliefs, transmitting moral codes, moral standards about how we sort of like form our like rules for our society. Ultimately, stories, yeah, like they are bigger than an intellectual endeavor. Like they're something which live with us on a bodily level too, and they tell us about who we are. I think that's quite magical, I think, to me. And just kind of thinking about that, the stories tell us who we are, then I think that is really important in knowing what the possibilities are then if stories were to change. And so this is a quote from Bruner where he says that narratives allow for the continuing interpretation and reinterpretation of our experience. Essentially what that means is that if the story changes, then our perception and understanding of ourself can change too. So you can apply this to all sorts of arenas. If you look at the stories that we tell ourselves sort of today about, or anything really, about homosexuality, and how the story about homosexuality for many people 60, 70 years ago will be quite different to the story that we tell ourselves today. When that story changes, then who we are changes alongside it. And you can apply that to a whole like wealth of different issues around sexual orientation, around race, around religion, our ideas about child labor, this is like hereditary monarchy, like etc. So like you could apply it to absolutely anything, and see that as the story changes, then who we are changes alongside it. And so it's really important, I guess, to hold that in mind when thinking about our children too, because we're going to get into thinking about some of the stories that our children have about themselves, and how that impacts on how they are in the world and what the power is, and I guess what the consequences of if that narrative changes for them too. So just a little bit about metaphor. So one of the things in stories and is that metaphor is very much our friend. So Margot Sunderland, who writes quite extensively about storytelling and using storytelling as a therapeutic tool, she writes that everyday language is not the natural language of feeling for children. Their natural language of feeling is that of image and of metaphor, as in stories and dreams. So yeah, I think it's really important to hold that in mind, that metaphor is very much something that I'll kind of keep revisiting as we kind of go through this webinar. And it's something that's really important as an avenue to bypass some of our cognitive defenses. So yeah, in metaphor, there's scope, I think, for hidden meanings to be embedded in a story, which are communicated in a more indirect way, and are able to be communicated at a deeper level. And so I think the indirect nature of metaphor is that it's a really useful tool for being able to decrease resistance, and allows for some of the sort of the meta messages to bypass our cognitive defenses. And so by metaphor, just talking about using one object or an idea in order to suggest a resemblance to another. So that could be through a symbol, an analogy, a parable, a figure of speech, could be through stories. That all of these sort of methods are really important. And how often, metaphors are sort of used in everyday life. Don't know why I was thinking this morning about this, but during sort of the height of the pandemic, one of the things that previous Prime Minister was sort of talking about was using like a whack-a-mole sort of method to identify various parts of the country where like cases of COVID had like increased, and then kind of implementing strategies to address it. So it's something which you kind of see come up even in sort of politics, in sort of everyday language, the use of metaphors in order to convey a sometimes quite complex message to a wide variety of people. And yeah, I guess like if just talking directly about things worked all the time with children in particular, then things like play therapy, art therapy, drama therapy, music therapy, etc., probably wouldn't exist. So I think there is some understanding that these things, like they're using metaphor, and creativity has a way of kind of speaking particularly to children on levels which, yeah, it's sort of hard to sort of understand always, but speak to children on a deeper level that just talking isn't always able to get to. And yeah, obviously listening to a story has an impact on, like, it's quite a strenuous brain workout. So yeah, being read a story activates the auditory cortex of our brain. Engaging with the story also fires up the left temporal cortex, so the region that is receptive to language. And that's sort of the part of our brain that's also capable of filtering out noise. And that is like overused words or cliches. So often how I will look at it is that stories, yeah, are just quite a strenuous workout for our brain. There are all of these different elements that are kind of activated, but there's like ultimately there's a top-down neural integration that takes place, that we have to activate our conscious thoughts, but we also have to activate our emotions and our body in order to engage in a story. So there's the requirement of the sort of the linear interpretive function, which is more of our sort of left hemisphere of the brain, as well as the processing of the emotion and sensation, which is mostly a right hemisphere part of our brain. So yeah, when listening to a story, like the listener or the audience have to pay attention to the characters, to like the personalities of those characters, the thoughts and actions, the emotions, the setting, but also like the sequence of the events. And at the same time, notice the storyteller's expression, their voice, their gestures, and their movements. So there's a lot sort of going on in that process, and it's quite, strenuous exercise, like a lot of exercise I think that our brains sort of get out of being able to engage in a story, which is, quite impressive, I think. So how does that all sort of relate to internal working models? So I'm not going to go into like loads of detail about sort of attachment theory, but essentially attachment behavior is a survival behavior. There's lots of information obviously out there about attachment theory, and John Bowlby and Mary Ainsworth and strange situation experiments and all of that good stuff. I've included some of that information on the resource sheet that will go out after the webinar. But yeah, as I say, like attachment behavior really is survival behavior that human infants are born vulnerable and dependent on caregivers in order to survive. And so in order to enhance that survival, they have to, we have to attach to a caregiver and sort of who's going to promote safety and protection and warmth and love and all of that stuff. And so, without sort of going into great detail about it, it's, I think, just important to hold on to the survival behavior, something that we all need. And the way that we attach and the sort of dependent on the response of the caregivers as far as like their emotional and physical availability. This will impact quite significantly on sort of the templates we have for how relationships work. And yeah, sort of in a nutshell, the infant has a need of some sort, where the infant is stressed, and the caregiver, parent, whoever comes along and meets that need and relieves the stress of that child. And in that process as well, the child is able to learn how to regulate their behavior through co-regulating with the caregiver. And over time, we'll sort of internalize those experiences and will sort of internalize that caregiver as their secure base, so that they're able to go out into the world and explore and know that they can always come back to that secure base for topping up. And so in a sort of secure attachment pattern, that's kind of what that process will look like. Obviously, there are variations of that where that pattern is different, it's more insecure. So, for example, the anxious, resistant, or ambivalent attachment pattern, where you're more likely to see, more hyperactivated attachment behaviors. So, like sort of more displays of distress or crying or clinging behaviors and things like that. Or an anxious avoidant pattern, where you're more likely to see an infant presenting as being sort of emotionally independent, more self-reliant, more compliant. And then you have a more disorganized pattern, where the attachment figure is both a source of reassurance and also of fear. And so the child isn't able to sort of organize their attachment strategy. And so this is often the case where the caregivers are unpredictable or frightening, or where there has been physical or sexual abuse. And so, yeah, you're more likely to see a child who's more bossy, aggressive, violent, self-abusive, things like that. The bit I really wanted to sort of talk about as far as attachment theory is the internal working model. So this is sort of the kind of the template, the child, like the basis, like the child, the template that the child is kind of going to use for how they view themselves, how they view others, how they view relationships. So the way that I find helpful to kind of make sense of this is the meaning-making bit. So based on all of the attachment experience that an infant has, and this usually sort of develops in the first couple of years of a child's life, and it obviously operates on a more unconscious level, but depending on what the child's experiences are in those early years, it will impact quite significantly on what their map or their template is for relationships, for how safe the world is, for how they view themselves, how ultimately they make meaning of all the experiences that they've had in those early years. So yeah, it's kind of like the basis for them to form their expectations and their predictions of how others are going to behave towards them in a caregiving context. And yeah, it's like I said, it's something which develops in those early years, even though it is a dynamic process and it's something that can change over time. Requires a lot of patience and consistency in order to shift it from whatever it might be in those early years. And so, yeah, it's really about thinking about how a child makes meaning of their early attachment experiences, how they then from there view themselves, how they view others, how they view relationships. So we were to think about that a bit further. So in a secure attachment pattern where the infant has a stressor of some sort, they're hungry, they're cold, and their parent, carer, caregiver comes along and meets that need, relieves the child's stress and meets that need with warmth and affection, with consistency. Then over time, the child is going to internalize certain kind of, the narrative that they're going to create about themselves is more than likely going to kind of fit these types of things. So the child is learning that my feelings are acceptable, that when I have whatever feeling, that this caregiver comes along to meet it. So these feelings are acceptable, they're manageable, that even when I'm stressed, I'm learning that actually I can relieve, like this caregivers help me to relieve that stress. And over time, I'm learning that like I can build the capacity to relieve some of that stress myself. I'm learning that I'm valued, that I matter, that I'm worthy of being loved, that I'm a good person who deserves to be loved. Over time as well, like I'm learning that, you know, if I behave in a bad way, that bad behavior doesn't define me. I'm able to learn the difference between guilt and shame. And that is that shame is where we view ourselves as being bad. And guilt is when we're able to differentiate and see that I have done something bad. And so over time, I'm able to learn that. But if we consider the meaning making that a child that has been abused or been neglected or been abandoned, what is the meaning making that they're going to be making around themselves? And it's going to be quite the opposite to this. So it's more likely to be things like, actually, my feelings are unbearable, and that my feelings don't matter because when I am stressed, no one comes to meet my need, or if they do, it's inconsistent, or it's met with aggression, or it's met with whatever. So that's all teaching me actually that my feelings don't matter. Lots of the children we see that can be futures will sometimes say things like, actually, I'm bad, I'm evil, I deserve all of these things to happen to me. I don't deserve to be loved. My bad behavior is who I am. So if I do something bad at school, it's because like I'm worthless and like I'm evil and I deserve all of these things to happen to me. I deserve not to be liked. I deserve to be hated. And often actually when children have been abused, they will internalize whatever narrative really that the abuser has sort of put out there. So for example, if an abusive parent is saying something like, I'm only hitting you because you're naughty, then that is often the narrative that the child will take on as well, and that's the meaning that they will make of that experience. So quite different, as we can see here between the two, and some of the meaning making that a child is going to be making where there has been abuse or developmental trauma. And thinking about like others and relationships, and just some of the meaning making that a child is going to be coming to in a secure attachment. So they're going to be learning when their needs are consistently met with love, warmth, affection, care. They're going to be learning that actually adults are reliable. I can trust adults to care for me and to meet my needs and to understand me. That relationships can be these affirming experiences where adult comes along, meets my need, and then they feel good about themselves and I feel good about myself, and there's this kind of dance that goes on. That is all sort of in the mix with the sort of secure attachment, and that I can seek out support when I'm stressed, that I can seek that out knowing that my needs are going to be met. I'm learning that people like me. I'm learning that people are generally kind, that people actually like accept me, understand me. So even when I express some big feelings, or if I am like really mad or upset about something, that I'm still accepted, that I'm still seen as me. That's all. Yeah, that's all one narrative. But obviously, it'll be quite different again for the child who has experienced developmental trauma, so abuse, neglect, abandonment in those early years, and that they'll be learning quite the opposite, really. That adults can't be trusted, adults are unreliable, that relationships are scary, that relationships are dangerous, that really I have to look after myself when I'm stressed because I can't rely on adults to come and meet my needs. So I have to take care of myself. That's the only way that I can survive. That everyone hates me, and everyone's out to get me, that the world is just a really dangerous place. Everyone thinks I'm a bad person. So again, narrative is quite different. And so it's really, I guess, important to hold all of that in mind when thinking about stories and like the types of stories that I'm going to be encouraging you to think about and to tell. And that thus requires you to play a bit of detective in being able to identify and hypothesize a bit about what your child or your children's internal working models are. So what is the meaning making bit? Like how have they made sense of their early experiences? What is their, like how have those experiences influenced how they view themselves, how they view adults, how they view other people, how they view relationships as a whole? Because the story that they're telling themselves, the stories that I'm going to be encouraging you to be thinking about and to try and construct is going to be stories which in some way challenge your child's internal working model, and support them really to integrate a different meaning. So we were saying before about when the story changes, then who we are can change as well. And so I think as a starting point, actually being able to hypothesize and to think a bit about what the experiences are and what the working models are of our children is really important. And that's a sort of starting point for that. So just to say on stories, yeah, I mean, so hopefully fairly self-explanatory that stories like have a beginning, a middle, and an end. And generally speaking, like there's a setting where these stories will take place. There's a lead character or a protagonist. There's a problem that's sort of set at the beginning of the story, and along the way, the protagonist has allies, adversaries that they sort of meet. Generally speaking, the story will be resolved by the end, and there's like a moral or a lesson or a theme in some capacity. Just to say on the protagonist, finding the sort of the right lead character for your story is really vital, obviously. And finding a protagonist that your child can relate to is really key. And being able to, like, the stronger the identification really between that lead character, the more likely the child is to internalize the message of the story. And that can be anyone. And so we talked a bit about using metaphor. Sometimes it might be a story written from the perspective of the first person, but using the third person is also really useful and really helpful sometimes. And so it might be an animal or a popular media character, or it could be a made-up person. I always just say as a word of warning that if it is like a popular media character, to be mindful to make sure that you know at least as much, if not more, about that character than your child does, just to just to hold any the likelihood of them sort of questioning everything about them. So for example, if it's a story about Harry Potter, and your child knows a lot more about Harry Potter, then they're more likely to question what they might be doing if it's not sort of in keeping with what Harry Potter might do, for example. So yeah, just something to sort of hold in mind when thinking about the story.